Anthony, Scott Piatt, Cage Rage, here with Miguel. Thanks everyone for joining us. HBO history this time around. Started in 1973. We'll give you a little overview of their basics. 1973, first fight was in Kingston, Jamaica. George Foreman, undefeated. Joe Frazier, undefeated. One of the neat things about HBO is they brought in all the talent, not just the boxers, commentators, ringmen. They put the show together. The production values were great. A lot of people might not remember that fight, George Foreman, Joe Frazier, but they remember Howard Cosell. Down goes Frazier. Down goes Frazier. It's kind of a big deal in our lexicon, in the greater cultural conscious. We remember that. We remember those things. So that's kind of what I remember about HBO. Rumble in the Jungle, Thrilla in Manila, which we'll cover in depth later. Julio Cesar Chavez, Manny Pacquiao, De La Hoya, Buster Douglas defeating Mike Tyson is in that lineage. Mayweather, Canelo, Cotto. In the past, you've had analysts and commentators, Bob Costas, James Brown, Harold Letterman, Jim Lampley. Max Kellerman took over for Larry Merchant. Larry Merchant was a big deal, particularly like him wanting to tell Floyd Mayweather, if I was 50 years younger, I'd whoop your ass, you know. So Roy Jones Jr. came on later. Great stuff, Miguel. So, and something that I've heard you talk about that I want to pitch to you is, you know, why do they quit? Well, there's streaming options, promoters, different subscribers. ESPN's getting back into the game. There's DAZN, or the Zone, as it were. PBC on Fox now. And then just this week, RJJ Boxing has come out, and that's Roy Jones Jr. is teaming up with UFC. So DAZN, or the DAZN, and Bellator have their subscription service, $9.99. And I think UFC is bringing in Roy Jones to kind of compete with that. So maybe that's the new model. Miguel, I know you have some thoughts on what's next now that HBO's leaving the boxing game. What do you got on that?
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting conversation here at the beginning of 2019. I think for, especially when you mentioned the end fighting, you know, in the little wrap-up there, the Miguel Cottos, the Manny Pacquiaos, the Floyd Mayweathers, the Saul Canelo Alvarez's, the top names in boxing have been on HBO especially the last 20 years. So wherever you're getting your boxing, it was always in a pyramid type of thing, but at the top of the pyramid was HBO. It was considered the elite of boxing. So now with the elite lost, there certainly is going to be some jockeying for position, but I think that this was because heavy lies the crown here. You know what I mean? I think being the elite for so long meant that, you know, they kind of became stale and became married to their own formula. You know, they had a limited roster. There was always the idea that, you know, Chocolatito recently, Golovkin, they were HBO fighters, right? And like I mentioned before that, Saul Alvarez, but people started working their way out of their HBO contracts and going other places, and they were already having to compete for the talent, you know? I think one of the things that killed them is that at the end of the day, Golovkin, who received a considerable investment, a lot of free TV fights for Golovkin over the last few years, when he went to pay-per-view, and with Alvarez, which could have been a torch-passing fight as far as HBO was concerned, to maybe get some of the interest away from Saul Alvarez and maybe have their own star that they bred themselves, whereas Alvarez was more of an acquisition, and it didn't work out for them that way. You know, at the same time, they got a lot of credit for the Chocolatito, and I do give them a lot of credit for bringing the smaller weight classes along under Golovkin, and they did a couple of Superfly cards, but the steam seems to be, you know, the legs on that, like a lot of HBO products, I think HBO takes the flashbang approach of like, okay, what are we going to do this year? What are we going to get done the next show? That sort of stuff instead of real long-term planning. And I think that catches up to you. And like I said, heavy lies the crown, and you mentioned with the Premier Boxing Champions putting boxing on free TV and things. The models are going to change here, and maybe they're just sort of cashing out, you know, before they sustain real losses, I think. One of the interesting things Chad said in the intro was that they went out with a whimper, and the last card definitely showed a little bit of, you know, to me it is time to move on, you know, because there wasn't really a celebratory, like, hey, you know, we're going out with a bang kind of thing or anything like that. And at the end of the day, it was the women who really deserve a better place in boxing, but that wasn't the way to get it. Not that card,
Yeah,
where
and
it's
you're
like, hey,
right,
goodbye, we're
that
out of
fight
here.
fell apart in the weeks leading up to it. The co-main event was supposed to be, you already mentioned, Chocolatito. It's supposed to be Roman Chocolatito Gonzalez. He gets a knee injury. It's supposed to be him versus Pedro Guevara. Then it's Guevara versus Juan Francisco Estrada. And then it's Estrada versus Victor Mendez. So the co-main event changes multiple times over the last few weeks of that event. It falls apart. Breakus does a great job, as she's expected to. Clarissa Shields looked good. Those two probably ought to fight at some point. They both look good. But then you've got this co-main event that they can't build any excitement about because it changes every week for the last month. So, yeah, it did go out with a whimper for sure.
Yeah, and, I mean, they're good fighters and stuff like that, but none of them is like a mega, a name or something like that was going to just put a signature on the card. And it was, it's the kind of thing where, nowadays people are looking for more ways to sell a card than just good fights. You know what I mean? It's like the guys, the men on that card, it was, 2 girl fights, ladies fights, and a male fight. I mean, they gave their all. It was a tough fight. They took the gravitas of HBO's last show, into the ring with them and put on good performances. They weren't standout performances, not fight of the year, or anything like that, but still, it was a good fight. But
sure,
it was HBO's lack of, they were already out the door, And I'm all right with that. I understand how you get there. Part of it is what you also mentioned is just the wear and tear on an infrastructure of having to replace a fight and having to say, it's like some dumb, this didn't happen or anything like that, but just the image, picture it in your head. Some dumb 18-year-old intern comes in and goes, I got 5,000 posters for Chocolatito's fight. Guess what? He's not fighting. Fuck you and your 5,000 posters. You know what I mean? For HBO, who paid for the 5,000 posters and the banners and the TV commercials and all that went into that, all of that wears on you. And it wears on a company and stuff like that. You gotta, if you're marching forward like the UFC, where they're full steam ahead, you've got infrastructure in place to work around that sort of stuff. But HBO being out the door was just like, fuck, we gotta redo the fight. Can we just? I'm sure somebody said, can we just do the 2 girl fights? You know what I mean? And
right.
It's like, no, we got 2 hours to fill. Or
well, let's back up a little bit.
At some point, there was no love.
Yeah, no, you're right. The end was kind of that way, but let's change a little bit and celebrate some of the fights they did have at this point.
Naturally,
they did have 45 years. 45 years. They went out rough, but a lot of careers end rough after 45 years. A lot of big things do. Let's take a look at. And I've got some notes on this. The fights that I kind of covered, and I really already mentioned the George Foreman thing, which is really a Howard Cosell thing even, and an HBO start. But I've got a quick look at Thrilla and Manila here. Let's take our listeners and our viewers on a little trip through the memory of Thrilla and Manila. I've got some of the different round by round, not every round, but a few of them. And then you kind of tell me what your thoughts on it are too. I mean, this is October 1st, 1975. They're in Quezon City, Philippines. Thrilla and Manila. It's Ali and Frazier. Now, reminded, this is Ali at 33 and Frazier at 31. They've already fought and had what's probably the better fight before this. But as far as these two guys getting together, it's kind of like the next fight I'll talk about, Mickey Ward and Arturo Gatti. We'll talk about them. It's the matchup that made the fight, and that's what this was. This was Ali and Frazier, their third and final one. It's not as fast or as crisp as 4 years before at the Garden, but there's a lot of drama. There's a lot of attrition. Of course, this is 15 rounds back then. So Ali says, he's quoted as saying it was like death, the closest thing to dying that I knew of. Ali, he starts off fast. Frazier works the body. Ali holds the left out and then surprises with the right. By the 4th round, Ali's talking a lot of shit, little mini rope-a-dope. 6th round, Frazier hits him up top and knocks Ali's mouthpiece out. I find this to be interesting. Knocks his mouthpiece out. Ali's goes flying in the 6th. The 11th, Ali's dancing around, plant, punch, Frazier lands some hooks. And the 12th is brutal. 13th, Frazier gets his mouthpiece knocked out, and it actually flies out of the ring. So a little turnabout there. And the 14th, Ali breaks Frazier. Swollen face. I mean, he's really beat him this point pretty bad. And Frazier's corner stops him, and they're quoted as saying to Frazier when they stop him, "No one will forget what you did here." But they stopped the fight. And so that was just a brutal thing. And Ali and Frazier both quoted as saying they, both basically felt like they were dying. So, yeah.
I mean, I find it hard to talk about that fight, and you did a terrific job there. But I do find it hard to talk about that fight because I think it's hard to give it its true weight. You know what I mean? Because what we're talking about here is we're talking about the legend of Ali, really. Because up until this point, Ali and Frazier had fought twice, as you mentioned. Frazier won the first fight, right?
Yeah.
And I think people forget that because now the second fight they come in, if I'm not mistaken, I believe the second fight is a 10 or 12 round fight, and it wasn't for the title, but then Ali won it. Now,
true, because the George Foreman versus Joe Frazier in 1973, Frazier had already defeated Ali before that fight. Right. And so he came into that fight undefeated. Now, people forget sometimes and don't give Foreman that credit.
Frazier, Ali fought him again, right? So it was something along. Let's just make sure we've got all that right.
Yeah. And then for Frazier to get knocked out in a minute 35 of round 2 by George Foreman in 1973, after he'd already beaten Muhammad Ali. I mean, this really set up an age of heavyweights that were formidable. And so and that's why I think you can talk about them being, Ali being second or third or even first, depending on how you look at it, of all time, because he did have such the competition. Whereas such a guy like a Mayweather maybe didn't have as much competition, sort of ducked some fights more, whatnot. Ali's out there fighting everybody.
See, yeah. So,
what'd you find out? Was it true?
So really fast, the path to the fights was that Frazier had beaten Ali, right? And then Frazier lost to Foreman in the fight that you're talking about, right? Yep. So now Frazier fights Ali again, and this time it's sort of a qualifier with a minor belt on. That's only a 12-round fight. And then Ali goes on to fight Foreman in 74. And then by the next year, after beating Foreman, Frazier gets his shot at Ali again, 1-1, with Ali kind of on top of the world after the Foreman win and things like that. So you're talking about the biggest fights in the world for HBO. You're talking about Don King and, fights in Africa and fights in the Philippines and international locations. And what you're looking at there, when you look at it from a business perspective, back then, it's a genius of a move, right? Because it's like, what can you do? Now business is very different, but doing something really worldwide before the internet was, something that you really had to be elegant in making it happen, And here is a perfect case of that because now you've got HBOs, you've got these mega companies. Like, imagine somewhere along the line somebody said Google's getting into fighting or Apple's getting into fighting. It means unlimited funds, right? It with real backing. Those are all fantasy situations. In the 70s, you had that for real because you had the Philippines with the coffers of a country putting up money for a fight. You're talking about $5 million for a fight for Ali and $5 million for Foreman. Talking about, that in today's money would be about $25 million for the fight or whatever. So you're talking about they needed a country to fund these fights. These were the biggest fights in the world. They did it in Africa. They did it, with dictators and stuff because the guys could do what they want. But this was an elegant appeal by the promoters to dictators, basically, to egos of the world saying, don't you want to be associated with the heavyweight fighting of the world and things like that? So definitely...
brilliant move. Brilliant move.
The great thing about all that story is that the in-ring fight between Frazier and Ali at the end of the day really does carry the day forward. All three fights, if you watch them, 15 rounds, 12 rounds, and then 14 of 15 fought in the last fight. I've had real detailed analysts and boxing folks. I've done it myself, and if you judge every one of those rounds again, and now it's hard in retrospect and stuff like that, but you could have one or two rounds tied, and then it very much comes down to like 21 rounds for Ali, 19 for Frazier, or 2019 and another tie. I mean, this was a true trilogy where in the last fight, it was up in the air. The reason they had a fight is because they were close fights the whole time. And neither guy gave an inch. And then the beautiful thing is these guys really did hate each other. They really did. I mean, and the insults that flew between them crossed several lines. You know what I mean? Especially, and they were weird lines because they're both black guys and they both used race, and it's the kind of thing that deserves real analysis and stuff by experts and things, because it goes beyond boxing. But with all that in mind and all the story, the fight between them really does carry. It does carry it. And that was at the start of HBO. HBO got enough juice off of that set of early fights in their career that they probably ran for 20 years with it.
Well, yeah, and you think about HBO back then, it's not what it is today, sort of this ubiquitous with their shows that they make themselves. They didn't have all that back then. They didn't have The Sopranos and whatnot. They had the movies they could show that had left the theater, and they had some sports, and they did. That's about what they had. And they didn't have the infiltration that they have now into the market. You think about the 80s, they started to come along a little bit more in the 80s.
Yeah, in the 80s, not everyone had cable.
Not even everybody had cable yet. And this is HBO putting these fights on in the 70s when a lot of people didn't have cable. So it was a coup for them, and it did help them build. And as more people got cable, well, yeah, you want HBO because you've heard of it. You've heard of it because of Muhammad Ali and Frazier and whatnot. It made a lot of business sense back then. It was a good marriage of product and platform. And so, but now I can understand why they've left that. Hey, let's go over what I call it's a trilogy, the Gatti Ward. I call it the 30-round fight. That's what I tend to call it. I mean, these guys went 3 10-round fights. And you just mentioned, if you look at all the rounds between Frazier and Ali, it's 20-19 or whatnot. All 3 of these fights were fairly close. With Ward, of course, having to win the first one, being sort of a lesser-known fighter at the time, putting on a great show and winning that first one set up the trilogy. Let's face it, from Lowell, Massachusetts, a journeyman road worker, he's literally out there paving in between fights. He's out there pouring asphalt. He's a brawler. He's making 10 to 15K tops for fights. He's 36 years old with 11 losses, right? Now, he trains hard, but he's the underdog. He gets a new promoter that says, I want to make this fight with Arturo Gatti. Gatti, Italian-born out of Montreal, raised in New Jersey, a boxer, puncher, until, he kind of give up that boxer thing as soon as someone would hit him, and he'd just go to war. World champ at 23. He does lose to De La Hoya, and his trainer, Buddy McGirt, gets together with Mickey Ward, and they make this fight. So the first fight is May 18th of 2002, and as I say, 36-year-old Mickey Ward's already 36. By the third round, first 2-3 rounds, Gotti's boxing. By the third round, it's war. Fourth round, Ward goes down on a low blow, and they take a point from Gatti. That becomes important. And then in the fifth round, Ward takes over fighting in a phone booth through the eighth. They end up giving the fight to Ward. I won't say it's because of the low blow. Ward fought a great fight and probably won that one on points. But again, when you look, that's the first 10 rounds of 30 rounds. They came out pretty even overall. You get to the ninth round, that's when Ward hits Arturo in the liver, and he goes down. And it's a 10-8 round. So now that 10-8 round, plus the point deducted from Gatti, Ward wins that majority decision. Round of the century, some people say. That ninth round was amazing. What Larry Merchant said about it is, we could see in front of our eyes this bond starting to form. It was a bond of pain and respect, So it starts to form, and that's kind of, we'll get to the other two fights, or what I call rounds, 11 through 20 in a minute. But you remember this fight, Miguel. This ninth round, this whole fight was something else. Where the hell did Mickey Ward come from? this bum's got 11 losses, you know. He's putting asphalt on the roads for the people of Lowell, Massachusetts. All of a sudden, you got two guys that are willing to stand toe-to-toe. Not the style I advocate for boxing. I prefer the sweet science, punch and don't get punched. But when these guys got toe-to-toe, I mean, what kind of war did we see there, Miguel?
Well, you know, it was a historic war. The point is, to me, I think here's the greater question. I think that you have to respect boxing for what it is, and boxing is a craft that when you see it, even if it's a guy with 10 or 12 fights or whatever, you're already starting to see a level of elite that you know people just can't fake, you know? So Ward, with his 11 losses and stuff like that, still physically was still pretty, you know, on top of things. I think when the body starts to break down, then the mind starts to question, and then you start a real long deterioration. But as long as your body's holding up and you've got a confidence and you know where you are in yourself, you got a guy with 11 losses, you're looking at a pretty damn dangerous fighter. You know what I mean? And I think that's what happened in that situation. Here was a guy that saw Gatti as a possibility, you know, and here's the other level. So he comes in, is Gatti an elite fighter? I think that was proven in his career that the answer is no. You know, I think you mentioned the De La Hoya fight. I think the Mayweather fight is another one where clearly Mayweather and De La Hoya operated at a different level than Arturo Gatti in the ring. That's no disrespect to Gatti, but the broader question then was, did the Mickey Ward Gatti trilogy and the lore behind it, was that what coasted Arturo Gatti into the Hall of Fame? Is he a Hall of Fame level fighter? Now that gives a lot of perspective on him now, because I believe the answer to that is yes. I think he achieved world championships. He did well, and I think especially in the modern era. And I think this is actually, you know, Mayweather's strongest argument too. But in the modern era, I think being a draw becomes a factor. And Gotti was a crossover ethnic draw where every Italian wanted to see him and every Irishman wanted to beat him, kind of thing. And Gotti, because of his capability to, you know, to draw people to see him fight, and Ward to a certain extent too. You don't get 11 losses, but you go to Lowell and ask, hey, who's Mickey Ward? You know, I got to be honest with you. I have to look this up to be absolutely sure, but I think this bright promoter here, and I'm not a promoter, I'm a matchmaker, but I hooked up with a promoter that did a fight in Lowell on a day Mickey Ward fought, and nobody showed up.
Yeah.
Hold on, what are the dates of those fights? I'm going to look up the fight in Lowell I did.
All right, the first fight was May 18th, 2002.
Okay.
Then you had November 23rd, 2002, which we're going to get to in just a second, and you finished on June 7th, 2003. So you can see we had all of those in 13 months.
Give me the dates?
May 18th, 2002, November 23rd, 2002, and then June 7th of 2003. So, yeah, while you're looking up that, let me go ahead and describe the second fight. We'll call it rounds 11 through 20. That does take place on November 23rd. Now, as you can see, we're just, you know, right around 6 months afterwards, so they're instantly going into that rematch. This is the first fight that Ward makes $1 million purse, so he went from paving roads to actually making money on this about 6 months after his first fight, where he pulls off the victory with that 9th round knockdown and whatnot. Early rounds, Gotti shows discipline, which is what he trained to do this time. He had learned. He got quicker and sharper. Things were looking good. In the third round, now something happens in the third round in both of these next two fights. The second and third fight, both third round importance. Ward goes down and he's wobbly, but he taps his stomach like, yeah, let's fight, I'm ready to go. But he took a jab in kind of an earshot, basically, that shattered his eardrum. Kind of a hook, and it shattered his eardrum in the third. So then Ward fought the whole rest of that fight, wobbly, off balance, but just fighting with heart, you know. So that's how that fight goes. Gotti wins it. In the 10th round, they begin the round with a hug. These two warriors. They end up, 1-1 now. The crowd is going crazy. Gotti demands. This is what I love. In the aftermath, there's some wrangling between the promoters, and Gotti tells his promoter, "Listen, Ward gave me a rematch. Ward gets a rematch. I give him one." So instead of making some other fights that might have been lucrative, that Gotti himself demanded that he fight Ward for the third and final time. So, what'd you come up with those dates on when you were?
Bingo. I mean, put it this way. The reason for this part of the conversation is because you got to give props to a guy like Mickey Ward, because I think there are a few guys out there that qualify as guys, that have losses that people still pay to see because of the way they fight with heart and stuff like that, and they still qualify as a draw, even if it's a local draw. And Mickey Ward was a very powerful draw in 2002, even with his 11 losses in Lowell, Maryland. Checking up on it, on May 18, 2002, which is, I believe, the date of the first fight, or the weekend of the first fight, we ran a show at the Sangas Arena in Lowell, Maryland.
Oh, wow. Wow.
And there were 3 UFC veterans on that show, guys that went to the UFC. Keith Raquel, George Rivera, and Mike Thomas Brown were all on that card. 3 guys that would be in the UFC. Dana White actually showed up at this show, I believe. If it wasn't this show, it was the next show, but it was from here that Jorge Rivera and a fighter named Travis Lutter that went to the UFC in the early Dana White days that he recruited them from. And, more power to him. But at the same time, the Sangas Arena is probably a 10,000-seat arena built for a minor league hockey team. But you got to keep in mind, hockey's huge in Boston, right? In the Northeast there. So they got a nice 10,000 seat. It was a nice modern arena. We booked it, and Ward and Gotti went down in Atlantic City the same weekend, and we got about 10% draw filled on the arena. And most people went to see the other thing. So,
he's a hometown hero. Hometown hero. I mean, he really is. They love it.
There's a place for guys like that. Ward deserves all the respect in the world because he carries that flag even now very well. In his retirement and stuff like that, after the 3 fights, after the movie and stuff, he's still a real humble guy. That story's a different, it went a different path, unfortunately. But there, you're talking about really, I think you've selected the trilogy of all time when we talked about Frazier and Ali. And then I think you're probably talking about the trilogy of the 90s, even if there were trilogies fought like in that era, like the Morales and Barreras and guys like that, man, fought trilogies at a higher level. But I don't know. I don't know if this wasn't the one that crossed over too. You know what I mean?
That's a perfect lead-in to give us the last 10 rounds here. Refresh everyone's memory on this. So the third round, a.k.a. round 21, June 7th, 2003, 13 months after the first fight, again when Ward's just a club fighter almost. Now he's world famous. Same thing happens here. Early, Gotti boxes well while he's still got his discipline before he gets hit too much. Early on, he boxes well. Now, here's that round 3 I alluded to. In round 3 in this one, this time it's Gotti's turn to sustain an injury. He breaks his right hand in round 3. He mentions it in the corner. We all hear him mention it, but he decides to go on. Round 6, Gatti goes down. And in the 7th, it's back and forth. In the 10th, they begin with a hug again, and they end with a hug. So it's back to that. They're being friends, and we can talk about how that goes on. I mean, they retire. Ward retires. He walks Gatti to the ring in the very next fight. He then trains Gatti for Gotti's last fight, I believe. So they developed a true brotherhood. Larry Merchant, going back to the fact that this is an HBO thing, Larry Merchant summed it up this way, and again, it really has to do with the fights, the production, and the commentators, and getting to that human spirit. He said this. He said, when the 10th began and end with the hug, he said their hugging each other was what everyone watching the fight wanted to do. They emptied themselves for us. They gave up a piece of their lives for us. Thanks, guys. This is why we do it. That's Larry Merchant for you. So a lot of respect to him and the guys that went out there and do it. That is why HBO did it. It was capturing those human stories. The vignettes before the fights, they tell you where the fighter come from, who he's fighting for, what he, what sort of neighborhood he's escaped or going back to, or what kids he's trying to feed, and they would really do a good job of explaining who the boxers were and why they're fighting. You could have that respect for the gladiator, even if you wouldn't wish that job on everybody that maybe your kid, or you understood why these guys were doing it from that gladiator perspective. And HBO gave us that insight before those fights, and they gave us these trilogies, and they gave us that poignant breakdown and analysis that guys like Jim Lampley and Larry Merchant in his way could give us. So that was one of my favorite trilogies, Miguel, and that was sort of how I remembered them, if you will. So HBO, right? Yeah, I'm gonna miss them.
Absolutely, and I mean, and you can go further down the line, as you said. I remember Larry closer to retirement, cursing out Mayweather, like you made a reference to and stuff like that. So HBO has been a fixture in the sport, and the two fights that we talked about, I mean, is there really, what about Buster Douglas Tyson?
Yeah.
I mean,
Japan.
When you talk about a guy, the thing that Tyson had, and I don't want to say hype, because Tyson had a lot of knockouts early, and Tyson, at the end of the day, for what he was skilled and put in the work, and also the boxing historian piece of him, I think, is underrated in terms of, what he knows about boxing in the sport and stuff. I think that's his education, but I think you're talking about a guy, when he came up, was there a scarier guy than Mike Tyson when you were, 12, 15 years old in the early 80s, and you start hearing about him, and you start seeing this, and it all comes to a head with the Spinks fight, And, with Spinks, you're talking, some of these fights might not be on HBO, but I'm getting to the Buster Douglas and the dethroning of Mike Tyson, which really was on HBO, right? And they might have been on HBO. That's your territory. You correct me, but the point is with the Spinks fight, Tyson, you had, Michael Spinks was a light heavyweight world champion, a highly skilled fighter, undefeated. He was definitely the underdog heading into that fight, but Spinks had that allure. At the end of the day, Spinks comes from the most decorated American family in boxing. When you consider brothers, his brother beat Muhammad Ali, for God's sake, at once, and then you're talking about several Olympic gold medalists in the family. So you're talking about a boxing family, a boxing guy who may be the best light heavyweight world fighter we've ever seen, right?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
So he moves up, and just everything about it, the body language that he exhibited into the ring, the fierceness of Tyson, the mauling it became, that moment, Tyson is the scariest guy in the world, right? So when Buster Douglas breaks through, extends that fight, and you're watching him, and they're fighting in Tokyo, and you know that Tyson's got everything invested in money coming up to fight Holyfield, and he's doing this fight as a 40-1 favorite just to get to what we witnessed there was something that, you'll never witness anything like that again. Tyson, that dethroning of Tyson, him fumbling around looking for his mouthpiece and stuff, it's just ingrained in my memory,
Oh, yeah.
So we could go through the whole list of fights and things, but I think that what's important to cover here is, and this is me guessing, and I know that the executives' names are out there, they're part of history and stuff like that, but I think when you're talking about doing fights with dictators in the Philippines and Ali and that history, and HBO's right there with it, I think you're talking about a head honcho at HBO that has the passion, that love fights.
That's right.
They're the business, and for 40 years, they made a lot of money off of that business, but at some point, there isn't a guy there who's like, man, who just loves. They were like, are we gonna do this, or are we gonna, invest in Game of Thrones? I don't even, is Game of Thrones HBO? If it is, then you can kind of see why there's other emphasis, and maybe people aren't going there as much, and they're listening to, metrics. It's like they got a business guy who comes in and says, less people are asking for boxing on our phone lines, and blah blah blah. So those business decisions.
They sold to AT&T Warner Media, Miguel. Just recently, AT&T and Warner Media brought them. So the history, I mean, it's not erased, but it's not part of their direct history. You see, the folks
in charge now. They bought it. They purchased it.
So they're not sentimental. They don't understand what it used to mean and what it might be able to mean in the future. But let's be honest.
Maybe the new executives have like kids in high school, and like they don't want their kid playing football because of concussions.
Right.
People like that you have to respect. And the bottom line is if they're worried about concussions in football, they're certainly not going to be boxing fans.
Yeah, and hopping back just a little bit before we wrap up, Tyson and Spinks, 1988, June of '88. They're both undefeated. They both have some part of a belt of the heavyweight championship.
Yeah,
so it is amazing. It was the largest fight money-wise at the time, 70 million, I think. Tyson made 20, Spinks made 13 and a half.
I mean, let me tell you, Mike Tyson, to me, he's one of those guys because you kind of live in stuff. But I think you're talking about a guy that I don't know that he's not a top 10 all-time heavyweight, and I think he might even tell you that. But I think for his moment, that as far as, and this is where the Arturo Gatti discussion also circles back a little bit, is what makes you a Hall of Fame fighter, It does, being a draw, help you? And like I said, I think it does. Mike Tyson's a guy, I don't know where, I got this quote around the time that he was doing the stand-up, post-AA, speech, City Hall type speeches that he was doing. He was doing some presentations and things. And he said that he made $350 million twice. That to me is so hilarious.
Yeah, meaning you lost it in between.
You made it again. It's like you didn't learn the first time.
Yeah.
But you're talking about a guy who I think is really misunderstood too. A lot of people like to sum him up as a criminal and stuff like that. Well, you're talking about a kid who came off the streets only because somebody found him with a little bit of talent. I read one book. I've read a lot on Tyson, but one book that I found to be one of the most interesting was by a Latin kid that wound up being Tyson's chauffeur for a while. Now, the chauffeur of a star can, at times see very intimate things. And this kid, Tyson didn't know how to read. Not to read a contract. That's not, you can read, I can see, Exxon, but can you read a contract and understand it? Would you even know if you're signing something twice?
Right.
And that's the kind of thing that gets revealed in there. So when Tyson's got Don King taking care of him, and he's got a contract with Don King that says this, and Don King creates a separate corporation, like, for example, and the stupid stories, right? But, so Don King is hired by him as a manager, and Don King is a management office. He's got other fighters and stuff like that. Why would Tyson have to pay the entire operating expenses for the entire office? It's not business correct. He's just a client. Why is he paying for the secretary and stuff like that? But he paid for all that stuff because he's not aware of what he's signing and stuff like that. So I think Tyson's a misunderstood figure. And then going to jail, I'm not saying he didn't deserve it. I'm not saying that he didn't cross the line with women or with something like that. But I'm saying that that there were people, too, who were supposed to be taking care of a guy that weren't there. And there's some structure around the heavyweight world champion that Don King was in charge of, that he was letting his guy down and stuff. And you're talking about a very vulnerable guy put in a very bad spot without his entourage that cared for him. I think Tyson becomes one of the interesting figures of the 90s. And I didn't even realize the Spinks fight had been on HBO when I mentioned that I was heading to the Douglas fight. Because Douglas is one of those, do they do a Cinderella Man 2 for Douglas? Like, how do you sum up Buster Douglas? You know, he broke through. His father died. Everything was written there, but at the end of the day, once he is in the glare of being world champion, I think even he knew, man, I'm not the right guy.
He disintegrated. You know, he doesn't even lose the belt back to Tyson. I think he loses it to Holyfield, and then he fights Hasim Rahman later, I believe, as well, which ends up disastrous. And so, yeah, I mean...
Yeah, you feel bad for Douglas, but at that moment in Tokyo, you know, that must have felt pretty damn good.
Oh, that was the jewel in the crown of his career, obviously. And he deserved it. He came ready, and Tyson wasn't ready for that fight. I don't think he trained properly, and that's not to take anything away from Douglas, but he's not the world-class athlete that Tyson was, but he came prepared, ready, and determined. And Tyson has everything problems, including Don King. So, but yeah, well, hey, as I say, a lot of respect to HBO. We'll miss him. I don't necessarily blame AT&T Warner Media for going a different route. A little more nostalgic, perhaps, than some others are about it. Having watched so much HBO boxing growing up, literally as old as I am. So I've never not known HBO boxing. But I'm looking forward to the Zone and what RJJ and PBC and ESPN and Fox, and I'm looking forward to what everybody else can bring, as I want to bring boxing back into more of a, not always a pay-per-view thing, get more people involved, and I think we're on an upswing. So let's thank HBO for what they brought us, and hope we move forward in a positive way that shines a good light on the sport, gets it back. Continues, I guess. It's back, but I want to see it continue to be accessible to new fans. So
exactly, yeah. I think HBO is going to leave a little bit of a gap. I think there's going to be some bucking for position. I think, you know, you can already see the Premier Boxing Champions probably Golden Boy with Saul Alvarez, and therefore DAZN. You know, who's going to take the mantle of being, you know, the HBO of now and the future, right. The big fights? Where are you going to go for the big fight?
Yeah,
is there
Showtime's still in the game?
Yeah, so that's what's going to be interesting to see is who grabs that mantle. I don't think it's totally apparent because boxing still remains fractured. We'll see if DAZN has any real ability to also start pulling in,
rein it in,
multiple promoters and a lot of promoters and maybe something in the structure of the way boxing works needs to change. So
that's right.
You know, discussions for another time, but HBO,
kind
of washing their hands of it, won't be involved in it. I bet you they'll be back if somebody were to say, "Look,
huge.
We got this guy and this guy. They're free from contracts, and we need an outlet." And, you know, someone like a Bob Arum who's broken up with them and gotten back together with them a million times. You know.
Yeah. Yeah, well, that's what I've got for the HBO history. Thanks to them. Thanks to you, Miguel, for sitting in. I think that wraps us up for this Cage Rage podcast from my end.
Always fun, again. Scott. Always a lot of fun. And, if you know, I mean, if we don't stop it now, we can just talk for a few more hours.
We'll go for another hour, so I'm going to sign off and say thanks a lot. See you next time on Cage Rage. Miguel, it's been a pleasure.
Take it easy, guys. Thank you.